Now I would like to introduce Kam Agahian, presenting the anatomy of the most challenging network engineering interview question. Kam is a member of the program committee and a director of cloud engineering at Oracle, having traveled from California to join us on stage today. This is Kam's third time presenting at NANOG, and it's a pleasure to have him speaking with us today. Welcome, Kam.
Thank you so much. Hi. It's 5 p.m. second day. It's like the worst possible time to talk about network engineering interview processes, right? But let's get started by something really interesting. Kind of brain teaser. Have you noticed who watches all the NANOG sessions, every single minute of those? Other than our director, Valerie, there is somebody else, a group of people. Our AV folks back there, let's just put our hands together for a second for those guys. Yeah, a lot of credit to them. We have a kind of interesting relationship. Once I was about to steal one of his microphones, and they caught me, I think, in Washington, D.C. But really, really great team back there. And I appreciate that. The second thing, quick show of hands. How many people are local? Like local, real local, not New York City undercover. Oh, okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Cool. And next question, how many people have seen my previous presentation on a similar topic, the one that we delivered in Austin, 2019? A few people. Thank you. Cool. So let's get started. This morning we had that session with Sylvie, a really great session on Google Network, Subsea Network, and I asked her that, can I have a few sentences in French so I can introduce myself, and but turned out it's very difficult. But she told me as long as you say bonjour, they're gonna love you. Exact sentence. So bonjour everyone, really great city. I appreciate your hospitality and hosting us this year. So my first name is Kam, K-A-M, Director of Cloud Engineering at Oracle. And I am here to talk about the anatomy of the trickiest network engineering interview question. This is kind of part two to another NANOG presentation that we had. But if you have not watched the other one, it's on YouTube. You can always get a hold of it. It was an interesting talk. So let's just have a quick look back. Around 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we talked about network engineering and interview questions. Before COVID, no masks, no work from home, nothing like that. I mean, we got together in Austin, and that was the session that I presented. Back then, it was a brand new session and kind of new topic, half controversial, one of those topics. But interesting thing was I got enormous feedback on it. Many people reached out. Still, believe it or not, 2 years on, people contact me with these stories. Some of the stories, funny stories, some really sad, touching stories. This happened to me, that happened to me. But the interesting part, something that really, really caught my attention and was sort of my motivation to put together the second session was the stories and feedback that I got from the interviewers. People who reached out just let me know, what, we watched this and we made these changes. Actually, a few people had me review their changes, and that was really interesting. You kind of feel like you are really making an impact here. So it felt really good. That is why I decided to put together another session, but this time not so independently. So I put together a survey, worked with 26 people. These are all veteran interviewers. All of them, they've done over 1,000 technical interviews for large companies. And the result of survey is something that we are presenting here today. What other things I heard from people. Some folks wanted us to talk about, the top 10 questions, or, let's just turn this into a tutorial for hour and a half and just talk about, the interview questions and process. Not really practical. So what we decided to do, NANOC 85 Montreal, was we had a few options. I thought about the broken process, talked about the cognitive bias, what they are. For example, if someone is young, cannot be experienced, someone is old, cannot be a quick learner. And also, another one, the third one is an interesting one, expectation versus reality. Many messages that people sent me about their interview experience have that element in that. What it means is, most people, this is actually kind of interesting. I have 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years of experience. And I went to this job interview and did not know 60% of the questions. Well, the other thing, I think the other kind of, sad experience was, I knew the answers and he answered them all, but I failed. Apparently what they had in mind was not exactly the answer that I offered them. So this time around, I decided to just grab the most commonly asked question based on the survey, and I went through hundreds of interview questions, technical network engineering questions. Let's find out what that question is. And then I'm going to have only 20-25 minutes probably here. Let's analyze that question and see why does that particular question could be the most challenging question or trickiest. So that was the kind of final decision, the reason I put this presentation together. Then we're going to have 30 minutes. That's going to spark some thoughts, and we're going to put our heads together, and hopefully next time, who knows, next conference or conference after, we'll get together and see what we did. So the tricky question, what really makes an interview question tricky? So first of all, technically it has to be a deep question. So your expectation is the candidate is not here just to spell out a bunch of things that they memorized. The previous presentation, we covered that. We talked about a whole bunch of bullet points. We talked about the things that people do ask, like all the BGP attributes, and people memorize inbound and outbound policies. And we don't want to do that. We covered that one. We also want to see some problem-solving skills. We want to see the thought process. We want the candidate to think loud. We also want to be engaged in a conversation with the candidates. Another thing is we want to see if the candidate is able to structure the answers. It really matters to many interviewers, according to the survey. And this is an interesting one. The questions that are multidimensional. What are the multidimensional questions? So when you look at this room, for example, there are a lot of components here. There are a lot of different things. The chair, the podium, all these things. And the list of these things, list of these verticals, list of these pillars, list of these things, that's the horizontal view. The vertical view is when you get down and focus on one of these options, one of these items, let's take that chair and talk about the elements there, talk about the material, talk about everything that they put together, and now it's called chair. So that is how we got to the last point on this slide. This is interesting. Very fair question, but how many elements are out there? Let's go back to this room. As you see, again, there are so many elements, and you can talk almost forever about each one of these elements. Here is an example. Let's talk about the trip from LA to Vegas. Well, there are a lot of different ways to take that trip. Of course, you can drive yourself. You could rent a car. You could drive your own car. Or, you know what? Someone might want to take a ride. I want to ride my bike from LA to Vegas. These are all valid options. But when you focus on one of these options, let's say the road trip, then you have the option to rent a car, and then more questions are going to come up. All right, how about the company? What's the best price out there? How about availability? How about insurance? Can I use my own insurance or something else? As you see, there's a tree, almost unlimited tree of questions. So Well, the interviewer is going to look at you and say, what if I decide to just walk over to Vegas? That's an option. I think that's really an acceptable behavior if really he or she does that. But sometimes it does not happen. Sometimes what happens is after the interview, when they are rating you or you're going through the debrief, that's the question comes up. They covered everything, right? They covered all the possible options to go from LA to Vegas, but they forgot this option is a super obvious thing. How do you not know that you could walk over? This is an old, like, just kind of traditional developer SDE kind of question, is that I have this small computer with limited memory and I want to run this giant code on it. But not so familiar to the computer engineering, network engineering community. So, and it eventually turns into a biased interviewing process. It turns into that process that the interviewer is getting bored, checking time, and you're not really hitting that very answer. We talked about that question, the BGP confederation versus reflectors. That was one of the topics that we talked about in the previous presentation. That's a prime example of those. There's so many different things that when you cover, eventually someone is going to find something that you'd not cover that. We talked about this. Architecture, great. You can cover probably 8, 9 items, but you're not going to talk about memory consumption. Confederation versus reflectors. And that is what's going to happen. So 25 minutes later, the candidate is lost, not talking about the topic you want. At the same time, the interviewer is running out of time, still have questions to cover, and you're talking to one of the brightest candidates. This person might be your best chance. So, what is that question that we want to cover today? This is the question that came out of this survey process. You put this address, the URL, in the address box, and your favorite browser. You might want to use links. You might want to use Google Chrome, Firefox, anything, right? And what happens? Just walk me through the steps. Tell me what happens when you enter this URL in that address box. This is one of the most innocent-looking questions. And according to the community of 26 interviewers, most people they interviewed, they cover DNS. So the response to that question in most cases is DNS. People will start on DNS, you actually have some slides on it, and forget about all the other things. But let me tell you what those other things are. So this is what came out of the survey. I could not find 2 people agree on the same answer. This is scary, isn't it? So same question, 26 interviewer, each interviewed hundreds of people, let's say over 1,000 people, so we're talking about 26,000 experiences together, and they have different points of view. Interestingly, it kind of goes back to the background. When you talk to people coming from a systems engineering background, they expected, even in some cases, to hear things like the system calls. When you talk to people from network engineering background, talk to me about the BGP, ASs, and all those things. So depending on the interview background, the results of the survey kind of changed. Interesting. How do you know as a candidate? How do I know as a candidate, right? I prepared myself. I spent 2 weeks to get ready for this call or in-person interview, and here's the experience I'm getting. Let's look at the possibilities, just some of the possibilities, just to be sure we're showing one example. Again, we're not trying to cover 10 interview questions. We're not trying to cover any question 100%, but what we're trying to do is we just want to show the possible layers that exist here and you might miss, or the interviewer might miss. As we can imagine, starts from layer 1 and layer 2, goes all the way to the hardware and how the hardware really processes each one of these packets. Here is an example. Layer 1, you know DWDM is a complex thing. And you know everything, many things probably about all the other layer 1 stuff. But most people do not cover anything layer 1 when they answer that question. It's not really technically a network architect's job, but how do you know? How do you know that is really not part of the answer? How do you know it is not what they mean? Layer 2, smart candidate is going to cover our MAC address. Let's find out what the MAC address is. Then let's structure the packet. This is how a packet is built. This is a layer 2 data. Here is a source, destination, the entire header. Let's talk about the VLANs. Let's talk about the proxy or process. And all this stuff, everything there, 100% valid answers. But what's left is there's a lot more. Each hop, I expected this candidate to talk about the behavior of each one of these hops. So that's the internet, right? You're going from one router, from here, you're hopping another one, another one, another one. You did not talk about it. Layer 2 is not going to die. It exists. But you cover just your laptop, the device that you're using its links browser to put the URL in. Another interesting example, the whole routing space. So I guess the same candidate, smart candidate, is going to cover the process from the computer that you put in the address. And most likely, you're going to have a default gateway. And you're going to contact default gateway through the layer 2 process. And from there, you're going to go out. So, of course, there's going to be some local routing setup within your building. You might cover that. You might say, all right, my building is running OSPF or stub area of something else. And that's how I'm going to get out of this room. That's how I'm going to get out of this office. But look at this. All right. Well, the candidate was talking about the laptop, but I really meant a router. And the router had a very specific route. And that route might have been pointing to the NAND address. That's a different routing decision than the default route. How do you know I have a default route? You never ask a question. Now you see the problem here. The expectation is you ask clarification questions and you find out where this URL is entered, what kind of station is requesting that web page. And the interviewer is sitting there and expecting you to cover /know that part of the answer. You were making assumptions, and those assumptions not exactly what he or she has in mind. Another example. Again, you were trying to route your traffic out of your network, and your answer is perfectly right. But guess what? My candidate did not talk about the convergence process. How do you know the network wasn't going through convergence? How do you know the network wasn't going through congestion? Encapsulation is another one. You made the assumption that there is no encapsulation, nothing going on. Guess what? I expected him or her to talk about an IPsec tunnel, SSL tunnel, kind of VPN tunnel on this laptop when you put in the command. That's a possibility. Forgot to talk about that possibility. Just made assumption that I'm running this command absolutely natively. And natively is right, but now I had IPsec, and I forgot to cover IPsec or any kind of VPN that I was running on my laptop, or I could have been running on my laptop. BGP, same thing. Again, a smart candidate is going to cover all that for you. I'm going to talk about the port number. I'm going to talk about all this stuff, ASs, all these circuits, double decision process. Even I'm going to cover the 2-byte versus 4-byte, how the AS updates are sent, and the whole story with that AS number. But here is a problem. There's a lot more than just native BGP routing. How do you know your service provider ain't running MPLS in the backbone for internet? Is it possible? So these are all different possibilities that eventually lead to a disconnect between the interviewer and interviewee. And these are really interesting cases, especially when you look at going back to that route reflector versus BGP configuration design. There's so many possibilities out there. With route reflectors, of course, I mean, there's a lot to cover, including the memory optimization that we talked about, and most people kind of skip that part. But configurations also could have route reflectors. But guess what? Even in PLS network, you can have route reflectors. I actually have a session I presented a few years ago. We're talking about IPv6, connecting IPv6 islands using MPLS and service provider backbone. And these are all possibilities that's fair game. Yeah, I meant it, and he or she never covered those. At least they could have asked. But how do I know that I need to ask all those questions about each one of the steps? As you notice, now that we have this horizontal view, now you look at each one of the towers, possibilities are endless. And interrupting the interviewer, asking questions at each one of the steps, at least would make me feel uncomfortable. I don't want to, ask 25 questions to answer one question. But this is exactly where we're headed. Another interesting thing, there is so much more when you talk about routing. And these are all the things that people mention. The candidates covered routing. I absolutely loved it. It was perfect coverage, right? But assumption was I had no ECMP going on. I had no load sharing going on. I had no hashing algorithm going on. Did not talk about really, how different routers handle different kinds of traffic. And it's important. These things are important. And interestingly, at least in 2 cases, as far as I remember, people mentioned that they use the depth of information provided here to determine the level of a candidate. So if you're hiring an engineer, covers this much. For a principal level, let's go all the way down. Oh yeah, he or she saw all these things, and you were talking about every single detail. But keep in mind, it's almost impossible to cover all these things. It's just the small list of possibilities here. So if you're just leveling your candidates based on the amount of information presented here, it is endless. So DNS, interesting thing. That's probably how this whole question is born, because that's how people cover that, right? Everybody knows about the DNS hierarchical model. I'm gonna talk about my device. I will go to my resolver. No, do you know or do you not know? Depending on that, we're gonna make a decision. And you can just jump up, ask question, one level down, one level down, one level down, eventually hit the right DNS server, get the answer, and we're done. That's how it works. Now, let's see what's hidden there. These are just 4 answers, 4 short answers out of the survey. Interesting, right? Most people make assumption that there are 3 root DNS servers out there. One interviewer told me that that's the wrong answer. Well, there are 3 DNS routes out there, plural, right? Routes out there, but they're not 13 servers. They're not 13 DNS servers. They're more than 13. Some of them are clustered of some other designs. 13 servers mean 13 computers. That's a wrong statement. Next one. The candidate answered the question. The answer was perfect. But these days, at least, let's say past 2 or 3 years, many service providers, cloud providers, hyperscalers, they do DNSSEC to make sure that the integrity of your packets responses are preserved. Did not cover that at all. It's important. Another interesting thing, the whole GSO video here. Cloud-based, on-prem, Canada did not cover that either. How do you know my network or their network or whoever's network is not using GSLB? That is a possibility that they should have talked about it. They did not. And local files. How many people here know what LM host file is? We remember what that is or was. Back in the days, there was the Win server, yeah, and some people would use that file, pretty similar to host file. Doesn't exist anymore, I guess, but yeah, possibility. We should have covered, host file, now the local files that help the name resolution process. Also, the local cache. How much detail do you need about local cache? Candidate did not cover any of those. And that was an interesting one. One of the favorite topics that my candidates talked about DNS, and when I asked them about the port number, it said DNS port UDP 53. It's wrong answer. Sometimes TCP. I mean, we have zone transfers, right? I guess. As you see, it's a rat hole. Really, there's no end to this conversation. If you want to push it, and the candidate does not know exactly what you mean or where you're going, could be absolutely confusing. And interesting thing, people with systems engineering background gave me some really, very interesting answers. So one of them is expecting candidate to run the some kind of tracing command on Linux box and know the system calls. I guess that's kind of not fair for network engineering interviews, but how do you know about the operating system? You're making assumptions. You're making assumption that it's a Windows operating system. Could have been something else. And security had its own whole chapter of topics. Different access lists, different filters, all different things. The candidate did not cover any of those, just made assumption that it's a wide open network and packets are traversing from left to right. And that's how we got to nanic.org, and that's why you have the page here. No, there are a lot of security devices here. Did not talk about the inspection process. And I guess just to summarize this, some interesting feedback for us, really for us, for whoever is interviewing people. We gotta be fair. Once I caught myself many years ago, not recently, many years ago, we were hiring an enterprise network engineer, and halfway through the interview, I caught myself asking inter-VPN option B questions. I mean, did you have MPLS? No, we did not. What were you asking? What are you exactly expecting to get out of that? Back then, right, my thought process was, if he knows that, he definitely knows my stuff. So I'm going to cover that thing, that like far, far thing on the horizon, and I'm making an assumption that he knows that. He must know this one. This is more basic. This is wrong interview approach. I decided to stop doing that. Another thing was the feedback process and the constant communication between the interviewer and the interviewee. It's really key. If you were interviewing someone and you feel the candidate is not on the right track, you are not putting the candidate on the right track. You're putting the interview on the right track. And penalties, losing points, it's an absolute bad approach. You got to ask a question, whether your question is clear enough for a candidate to answer, or it's absolutely fair to have some ambiguity and see how the candidate deal with it. But at the end of the day, it's your interview, and you have to make sure that the candidate is on the right track and answering your questions. And let's avoid the guess what I'm thinking of model. We had that in the previous presentation, and we covered that. That's absolutely not fair. So this was just one of those examples, what came out of the survey that I conducted based on feedback I got from the previous NANOC presentation. And I personally liked it. I actually started using many of these lessons. And I hope everybody else finds it informative. Thank you so much for, again, being here, paying attention to this session. I know it's 5:30 p.m. almost, so really appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you. Peace.
Thank you, Cam, for the presentation. We'll take any questions. We have about a minute. Anyone from the live audience that wants to ask? Name and affiliation, please.
Still at AIR, still internet too. Based on your slides, as a security engineer, I do have to ask, why does your router have a web browser on it?
These days it's absolutely wrong practice, but these days it's possible to even run an operating system on a router.
Yes.
A whole different operating system.
But
Yeah.
as a security engineer.
Actually, somebody else asked the same question, and you're right. You're right. Oh yeah, totally. I agree with you. I give it to you. Yep.
So, I mean, one of the big things you focused on was how multidimensional questions can get just way off in the weeds and unconscious bias.
Absolutely, yes.
What about if you're interviewing on a role where you want to see how deeply they can troubleshoot, or you want to know how they think laterally? How do you get both that problem-solving ethos without the gotcha type thing you warned about?
Let me do my best to answer that question, right? Because we had that problem too. And the way we answer that question may or may not work for you, but I will give you the answer. We do homework. So we give a candidate a scenario. You take the scenario home, study that scenario, build something, you come on. Someone's gonna join that call, interview number 1. We're gonna do a quick break and fix. We're gonna ask questions, we're gonna do a break and fix, hands-on troubleshooting, we will see how it works. Some people like it, some people do not like it, but that is probably the, I guess, fairest way. It's mutual, right? For us to see how hands-on you are, and for you to show your hands-on skills. And the best results, again, goes to the candidates with a lot of hands-on experience, especially people starting for certifications, those things, absolutely hands-on. A bunch of show commands, troubleshooting, capture this, filter that, here's the result, that's why it's broken, this is how we fix it. But not super useful for sales engineers, for consulting engineers, for not so hands-on, mostly whiteboard people. For that kind of interview, I can see a smile. For that kind of interview, yeah, we still do whiteboard, and you got to structure the interview in a useful way. We used to use paper, for example, output of BGP show commands, right? And it would change some lines and some stuff in that. This is a broken network. That worked too. But I personally like the live troubleshooting sessions better.
Okay. Well, we're
And
out
I'm
of time.
I'm not the candidate. So the fact that I like it, I'm sitting on the other side of the table.
No, sorry, we're out of time.
You are, okay. Yeah, absolutely. 4 minutes over. Please feel free to reach out. Twitter, LinkedIn, always accept connections. I would love to talk. I would love to hear your experience. And let me know. Let me know if this helps, and let me know what else you'd like to know. I do have access to a range of people. We can do surveys, and we can put our heads together, see how we can improve this process. I really appreciate your help. Thank you.
Thank you again for your
Thank you so
presentation,
much.
Cam.